to Slavoj Žižek's book, The Incontinence of the Void, which was published as part of the MIT Short Circuit series, co-edited by Žižek himself. And I'd like to give you a brief introduction to the introduction so that you might be interested in reading it yourself. And there's a specific passage here where Žižek talks about his tics and how it relates to his philosophy. Specifically, he's responding to someone who wrote a pathologization of his tics, ascribing to them a certain philosophical meaning that Žižek rejects. Along the way, I would also like to provide you with a basic introduction to what Žižek's ontology is. He responds to the criticism that he does not have one. In fact, one might characterize Žižek's ontology as a move beyond the impossibility of ontology towards an ontology of impossibility. All that and more I'm going to try to cover in the next 30 minutes or so. But before I begin, thank you to everybody who's joining me live today. It brings me so much pleasure that we're connecting around the world, and please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining from. This is an open access lecture series that I've been hosting for the past couple of years, and my goal is to make philosophy and theory more accessible without losing the complexity. So thank you to everybody joining today, and if you'd like to download my complete guide to Žižek ebook series, you can find that on my Patreon. A huge thanks to the patrons who help me keep making these daily videos. Okay, so let's begin. First of all, this is a lovely edition, I think, of The Incontinence of the Void, excuse me, with the photograph by Yves Klein from 1960 called A Leap into the Void. In fact, the title itself is a reference to a Samuel Beckett play, which Žižek cites in the opening of this very book. Incontinent the void, the zenith, evening again. When not night, it will be evening. Death again of deathless day. On one hand embers, on the other ashes. Day without end, won and lost, unseen. From Samuel Beckett's Ill Seen, Ill Said. And the subtitle is actually quite important as well. The subtitle is Economico-Philosophical Spandrels, and as Žižek clarifies in the beginning, a spandrel is an evolutionary concept which derives from architecture that is meant to designate a feature of an organism that is to some extent external to its necessity, and yet because it's an unusual particular feature, it nevertheless adds a certain quirk, a certain usefulness or utility to that animal or that mammal, that evolutionary species. And Žižek's basic argument is that if we want to practice philosophy today, we have to look at the so-called philosophical spandrels, namely pop culture, politics, political economy, etc. Žižek is essentially characterizing his own style, which incorporates a popular analysis of these things as a political project that engages with the spandrels of contemporary philosophy. So I'd like to begin with Žižek's rebuke or rebuttal to a criticism that he mentions here. Specifically, a criticism that was made in a text called Repeating Žižek, which was written by Jamil Khader. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. In which Jamil Khader draws a distinction between Žižek's philosophical style and the philosophy of Alain Badiou. Alain Badiou and Žižek are good friends, although nevertheless their philosophies are quite different. Alain Badiou, whose most famous work is arguably Being and Event and the corresponding series of this ongoing project, is highly critical of psychoanalysis and Lacan in particular. Whereas, as most of us know, Slavoj Žižek argues that we cannot forego psychoanalysis if we want to revitalize the philosophical project in its post-deconstructionist turn. And in this text, Repeating Žižek, Khader makes the argument that Žižek's tics, quote unquote, simply betray an anxiety about being excluded from prestigious institutional apparatuses and departments of philosophy. As such, he performs the role of the hysteric to the quote unquote master's discourse of a stoically unfazed Badiou. Now, Žižek has two problems with this. On the one hand, he says he refuses and rejects this pathologization of his tics, and he explains that this is part of an organic illness for which he takes medication Therefore, it has nothing to do with a supposed hysteria about his not being part of the proper philosophical institutional framework, or whatever that's supposed to be. But he says, more importantly, he rejects the binary framing of Badiou as a serene, stoic master of philosophy and himself as a hysteric. In fact, Žižek says that to properly practice philosophy today, one has to understand in a very precise way how philosophy, after the Kantian turn, is itself hysterical. That the very notion of a pre-critical philosophy of the master, of an idealism that is not hystericized, if you will, by the Kantian Hegelian turn, is itself highly ideologically suspect. And so that is Žižek's basic argument apropos of this accusation. He says, on the one hand, my tics have nothing to do with my pathology. In fact, it's quite vulgar to pathologize my tics as a supposed return of the repressed of my inner anxiety about being labeled a cultural study theorist instead of a proper philosopher. But moreover, the very insistence on this division between proper philosophy versus hysterical philosophy is antithetical to the rejuvenation or reframing of philosophy to which Žižek has dedicated himself throughout his entire career. But let's take a step back for a moment to talk about not only Žižek's own ontology, but perhaps more broadly, what exactly philosophy is. Like, where do we stand today with philosophy? And here Žižek has, I think, a pretty common sense argument. He says, philosophy today has been relegated to a secondary position, which is to say that at best, we are called upon as philosophers to give meaning to things that challenge our understanding of reality, usually as a result of scientific discovery. In other words, science has essentially taken over the place that philosophy once held. Instead of trying to understand the meaning of the world by means of philosophical inquiries, we instead practice science. And scientific discoveries, be it about the universe or about our brains or nanotechnology, raise those questions, and then we look towards professional philosophers to give us the answers, or perhaps not to give us the answers, but to articulate differently the questions. Here we have what is essentially university discourse. It reproduces knowledge quite precisely, not simply by disseminating it, but by reproducing scientific advancements and scientific knowledge in a philosophical guise, thereby lending it some form of legitimacy. And so if you read the newspaper or listening to the news, professional philosophers will usually be asked to comment on scientific discoveries and the questions that they raise about consciousness and meaning and reality, etc. Žižek says that this role of philosophy as a secondary commentary on scientific discoveries means that philosophy has essentially lost what you might call its cutting edge. The cutting edge by which philosophy is precisely supposed to critically investigate the very gap or break that is introduced by science as such. In fact, Žižek says that the introduction of scientific knowledge, even if you go back to antiquity, was always something that presented itself as a kind of traumatic break with subjective reason, with common sense. I actually have an example of this that is quite contemporary. I was watching a TikTok video the other day in which two podcasters were debating whether or not the Earth was flat. And the person who was defending the fact that the Earth is a sphere, the scientific reality, if you will, argued that there is no model that can prove that the world is flat. And here the opponent in the debate had a wonderfully naive, realist rebuttal. He said, well, it looks pretty flat to me. And here we have the perfect break, if you will, that science presents with common sense. If you go outside and you simply look around, to all intents and purposes, the world appears to be flat. However, it is by means of scientific knowledge that we can understand why it is not flat. And yet, nevertheless, this understanding relies upon, to a certain degree, scientific and mathematical abstractions. Hence, what science does, paradoxically, is that it doesn't introduce, if you will, rationalist, empiricist sense upon the subject. In a very precise way, science actually introduces the opposite, a certain fundamental doubt as to the subject's own perception and own reality, which is to say that science introduces an access to reality that nevertheless relies upon us to be in some way dependent upon abstraction, which is to say, to believe that it works. Of course, the key principle of science is verifiability, which is to say everybody should be able to conduct the same experiments and go through the same mathematical formulas and thereby achieve the same results. And if not, then clearly something is wrong. And yet, by definition, the majority of the population cannot do so, does not have the skills in order to do this, which means that everyone on some level has to believe that it is true, has to believe that it works. Hence, the introduction of scientific discourse and the production and reproduction of scientific knowledge relies upon institutions that can guarantee this truth. This, therefore, becomes an ideological innovation inasmuch as a scientific one. For example, when I drive a car, I don't know exactly how a car works. When I use an internet or my iPhone, I don't know exactly how it works. I simply know and believe that it does. Of course, there are people who are highly trained and skilled in order to guarantee that it keeps on working, but at a certain fundamental level, beyond the basic cognition that I have from my primary and secondary and higher education, I don't exactly know how these things work. Therefore, one of the arguments that Žižek makes, although he doesn't make it as precisely in this introduction, is that science introduces a break with subjective reason, which is to say that science, which is supposed to be the bastion of enlightenment and subjective knowledge, actually hystericizes the subject. To go back to my example, science introduces the problem that what you see is not always the most accurate reflection of reality. Hence why the flat earth person who says that when he steps outside his house and sees that the world is flat, nevertheless sees something which is fundamentally untrue. Here we have the philosophical dimension. The philosophical dimension is supposed to realize, if you will, this break between subjective sense perception and the introduction of abstraction by means of empiricist and scientific means, which say that traditionally philosophy and science were supposed to work hand in hand. Not so that philosophy could provide some epistemological musings upon scientific discoveries, but precisely so as to, in a sense, cover up this very break, investigate it, this gap, inhabit it between science and common sense perception. Now, the way in which Žižek puts it is like this. He says, let me make sure I have it. Philosophy, therefore, in its earliest guise in Plato's idealist system, emerges as a response not just to the sophists, but also to the emergence of the scientific framework, a scientific framework which therefore introduces a radical break between what is true and what is not true, between what can be known and what can be assumed, or, to perhaps put it more precisely, between what is known and what can be deduced. This means that, quote unquote, for Žižek, philosophy, in its elementary guise, is a reaction to the sophists as an attempt to close the gap opened up by the sophists to provide a foundation of truth to words, to return to, quote unquote, mythos in the new conditions of rationality. In other words, Žižek's basic argument is that sophistry emerges against the backdrop of scientific innovation that promises and heralds the opening up of a new inquisitive subjectivity. Essentially, the scientific framework opens up a horizon against which anything can be true as long as you properly make the case for it. Against this, philosophy emerges to defend the properly rationalist core of scientific inquiry, which is to say it preserves its abstract core. This means that philosophy emerges as an attempt to reconcile science with mythology. Hence why Plato's philosophy, which is a rationalist scientific system to a degree, which is to say it is supposed to be based on a logical proposition of forms, nevertheless is fused with an idealist or religious mythical notion of essence, the world of truth beyond the cave. And Žižek says that in a very basic way, this was always the promise of philosophy, to fuse the rationalist turn heralded by scientific development with the religious, ethico-spiritual, mythical dimension of idealism. Against this, the Kantian Hegelian turn is distinctly hysterical, which is to say, the Kantian turn makes idealism, and thereby philosophy, which until then in its Western form had been idealist, essentially self-reflective. Kantian philosophy becomes introspective, it becomes paranoid, it becomes critical about the very preconditions that must exist for philosophy to take place. And Hegel is the one who then turns this very Kantian hysteria, this Kantian critical turn, this self-reflexive position, into its own system. Hence, as Žižek points out, in reference to his first book and his PhD thesis, this is why Lacan designates Hegel as quote-unquote the most sublime hysteric. Hegel is therefore the one who takes this very hysteria, this very self-reflective turn that stands against the entire idealist lineage going from Plato to Descartes, the famous self-transparent subject, and turns this very hysteria into its own system, into its own totality, as it were. However, this means that, strictly speaking, Hegel's system is not a system at all, but, if you will, the systematization of a method, a Kantian critical turn. Therefore, if Kant proposes a method that inherently undermines the very foundation of Platonic idealist philosophy, and yet nevertheless wants to continue it, Hegel is the one who takes this method and turns it into its own system. And a system in which the subject and the subjective impossibility of any complete idealist ontology is itself the very grounding upon which such a system might be based. To put it a little bit more simply, it's like Hegel turns the entire lineage of Western philosophy inside out. And this turning inside out can be characterized in the chiasmic formula of Žižek's own ontology, namely not the impossibility of ontology, but an ontology of impossibility. After all, after Kant, which is properly realized by Hegel, we have an impossibility of ontology, an impossibility of an idealist, essentialist form of ontology as proposed by Plato. This new ontology, the ontology of impossibility, which might therefore be characterized as an ontology of hysteria, for Žižek must be and can only be properly seen through the lens of psychoanalysis, specifically the Lacanian rereading of Freudian psychoanalysis. Essentially what Žižek is therefore proposing is that if we want to have a return to ontology, it cannot simply be one of the new materialist, quote-unquote, naive, according to Žižek, ontologies, which is to say, it can't be speculative realism or object-oriented ontology. We cannot go back. Instead, we must go through. Through what? Through this very hysterical turn. And it is only, according to Žižek, this is the central wager and the gambit of his entire philosophical project, it is only by means of going through Lacan that we can properly bring philosophy back into its historical alignment. Žižek's basic proposition, therefore, is that psychoanalysis is, quote-unquote, a rebuke to philosophy that is internal to it, which is to say, the psychoanalytic stance against philosophy, it presents an anti-philosophy of sorts, is internal to the very lineage or development of philosophy after the post-Kantian turn. Now, to go back to the original passage, the criticism of Žižek in the book Repeating Žižek, in which Žižek's tics were supposed to be a hysterical symptom of his self-conscious awareness of being outside the philosophical tradition, in contrast to Alain Badiou, now we can start seeing how ridiculous of a position this actually is. Alain Badiou himself, even though he says that any philosophy has to be based on mathematics and presents himself as a serene Stoic figure, is not the philosopher of pre-Kantian Hegelian idealism. This would itself be a kind of bastardization of Alain Badiou's philosophy. But Alain Badiou wants a return to ontology, except Alain Badiou rejects the Lacanian reading of ontology and instead tries to ground it in his theory of the event, specifically in the idea of mathematics or love, which he likens in, to my mind, a very Hegelian fashion. Žižek, on the other hand, says that we have to take psychoanalysis and use it to reframe Hegel as, and this is key, Hegel as the ultimate sophist. This is one of the more interesting claims that Žižek makes in the introduction here. He says that, in a certain sense, one can make the argument that Hegel is the ultimate sophist, which is to say, Hegel creates a philosophical system, a system which is a radicalization of the Kantian critical method, on which there is no solid grounding for any reason. There is no solid grounding upon which the subject can participate in ontology, hence the impossibility of ontology becoming the very ontology of impossibility. And this is perhaps where we can see a difference in a very easy to understand way between Žižek and Bourdieu. Bourdieu argues that the central antagonism in philosophy is that between the philosopher and the sophist, going back to Plato. Žižek argues, and he's not the only one to do so, that sophistry and sophism is actually integral to the development of philosophy. In fact, sophistry is in some sense the highest form of philosophy. It's necessary antithesis, it's negation of negation, if you will. In fact, Žižek says that he risks here a mock Hegelian reading of the transition of philosophy, namely, science is a negation of religion, which creates the world of sophistry in which anybody can argue anything, which then becomes a negation of negation, which is philosophy, the systematization of idealism. And within this negation, we have, of course, a further negation of negation, being sophistry. To put this a little bit more simply, sophistry is even necessary within the idea of the Platonic dialectic, which is to say it's only against the positions of the sophist as interlocutor that the logical formulations, which are not only evidence of Plato's system, but also, if you will, an analogy for, which is to say that they stand in place for the very forms he is proposing, which require this antithesis with the interlocutor of the sophist. Hence, the sophist is not just the enemy within philosophy, but also the necessary antithesis. And Žižek's argument here is that all of the anti-philosophies, which Alain Badiou rejects as forms of sophism, be it the anti-philosophy of psychoanalysis, or even, although Badiou himself is a Maoist, the anti-philosophy of Marxism, stand against the true traditional goal of philosophy. Žižek's argument is that the Hegelian turn presents the sophistical turn in philosophy, the hysterical turn, by which philosophy is turned inside out, and true philosophy can now only be practiced against the horizon of sophistry, of hysteria. Essentially, therefore, Žižek's subtitle here, Economico-Philosophical Spandrels, which is to say all of his little engagements with pop culture and politics, these polemics and cultural studies snippets, are necessary readings to philosophy as such, which says Žižek's basic argument is that we can't return to an abstract philosophy of pure ontology, naive pre-critical ontology. Instead, philosophy must stand at the interstices between all the symptomatic renderings of a supposedly post-philosophical world and the return to a philosophy of, if you will, Hegelian hysteria. Now, it's important to note here for context that for Žižek, hysteria always has a positive connotation, in the same way in which sophistry here takes on a positive meaning. And this is very Lacanian. For Lacan, hysteria was the only mode for the articulation of truth. It was only by means of hysteria that the subject could acquire or know truth. Hence why the relationship between the analyst and the person undergoing treatment is a relationship of hysteria. The patient wants the analyst to be a master figure who can tell him his truth, and yet the analyst refuses to be this master and refuses to yield said truth, therefore making the subject speak hysterically and essentially articulate the forms of his own truth. And Žižek says that something similar happens within contemporary philosophy. Instead of wanting some serene, stoic master of philosophy to give us the truth, we become hysterical subjects, analyzing and thinking critically about the manifest symptoms of contemporary ideology against the backdrop of contemporary late-stage capitalism. And it is within this myriad reflection of contradictory stances that we find a return to truth, a return to philosophy. Essentially, Žižek's argument, to put it very simply, is that what some people level as a criticism of his work, namely that it is not a proper ontology, that it is simply a polemic, is in fact his wager apropos ontology, that the only way to return to ontology is precisely to engage in this never-ending polemical cultural analysis of contemporary ideology. Now, I'd like to conclude here by essentially giving you a very brief breakdown of Žižek's own argument in this book, which he also proposes in the introduction. And Žižek says that to make an ontological argument today, we have to go back to the triad of what he calls UPS, namely not the United States Postal Service, but universal, particular, singular. And traditionally, UPS would have been conceived of, and I've written it down here to make sure that I get it right, would have been conceived of, I know it, but I want to make sure that I get it right, as the universal representing ontology, the particular representing sexuality, and the singular representing objectivity. Now, this raises certain questions. That the universal as ontology makes sense. Even from the dimension of Platonic idealism, the universal, i.e. truth or essence, is an ontological question about the nature of being, pure form. But why relate the particular to sexuality? Well, here once again, Žižek is being Lacanian. It's not just sexuality, it's about Lacan's theory of sexuation, which to say Žižek's central argument is that the particular is the central and constitutive antagonism or difference that marks and overdetermines the universal from within. Now, Žižek derives this from the Lacanian theory of sexuation, in which sexuation, and the sexedness, if you will, of the subject marks a certain fundamental impossibility that is constitutive to the subject as such. And Žižek says that, quote unquote, in order to have a subject, the antagonism that cuts across reality has to acquire a form of sexuality. Sexuality is therefore not simply a metaphor of the fundamental antagonism that, as he puts it, cuts across reality, namely that reality is incomplete, that it is structured like a fiction, to put it in Lacanian terms, as Kant already realized. Reality is something which is posited by the subjective mind. And yet, sexuality therefore becomes the key. It becomes the key interpretive mechanism by which we might understand what an ontology of impossibility might look like. And Žižek says that when it comes to sexuality today, there are two modes in which we usually engage with it. One, an ontology without the antagonism of the subject, like yin-yang, masculine versus feminine, an essentialization of male and female traits. This is a kind of return to a pre-critical naive ontology to which the subject can simply correspond, the essence of masculinity versus the essence of femininity. Against this, we have sexuality with the subject, but without ontology, which is to say the psychosexual social explanations. People act in a certain way because they are men, or they act in a certain way because they are women, and therefore if we can eradicate sexual difference, we can have a more equal and more thriving society, a kind of liberal feminist ontology after the fact. And then we have the ontology of sexuation as such, the Lacanian ontology, if you will, which Žižek is interested. And his basic argument is that sexuality and sexual difference, namely the idea that the subject is constitutively split by a certain immanent impossibility, is therefore the very truth of the universal, which is to say that in the very same way in which the subject is barred, split constitutively from within by what we call sexual difference, the universal is barred or split from within by what we call the subject. Therefore, the Lacanian theory of sexuation, which I've talked about in detail in the video on Alenka Zupancic, but which I could do in a shorter video, essentially works as an interpretive model and framework by which to understand and reframe an ontology of impossibility. Now, we've forgotten the third in the UPS series, namely the universal, the particular, and the singular. The singular, therefore, is subjectivity as such, namely symptomatic contemporary life. And Žižek's basic wager, therefore, is that we should take the UPS triad, universality of ontology, particular of sexuality, namely the antagonism that is constitutive to the universal, and the singular symptom of contemporary subjectivity, and we should turn this into a different model, namely not UPS, but SOS. And SOS essentially inverts UPS by making the universal not the immanent beginning a priori grounding, but instead that which exists in the middle. SOS, therefore, is sexuality, ontology, and subjectivity. Hence, ontology becomes a retroactive, excessive after effect of the immanent constitutive stain within the subject as symptomatically singular within contemporary late-stage capitalist society. Now, if that sounds like a lot of word salad, which I can totally understand if it does, it actually goes back to the subtitle here, Incontinence of the Void. Instead of an a priori void from which subjectivity stems, and which now we have a void which lies at the middle of what is essentially a chiasmic framing. SOS might well be written as ABXBA, a void which leaks out, a void which is internally immanently constitutively split by this subject. And here we have, therefore, the economic philosophical spandrels. These spandrels are no longer excessive features which are purely contingent. Instead, they themselves are the key to the organism as such. Therefore, what appears as the excessive exception to the organism, the spandrel within evolutionary biology, is itself what creates and contains its key. In the same way that the subject, rather than being the excessive contingent exception to the universal, is precisely what posits retroactively the very presuppositions by which this ontology might be known. Hence, we are back at the ontology of impossibility, an ontology of the subject, an ontology of contemporary psychoanalysis, or if you will, a psychoanalyzation, a psychoanalytic infusion into post-critical, post-hysterical ontology. That is Žižek's The Incontinence of the Void. Keep in mind that this is a very basic introduction to what is a much longer book, and if you'd like to read it, it is part of the MIT Press series called Short Circuits. And if you'd like to learn more about Žižek in a highly condensed form, you can download my complete guide to Žižek ebook on Patreon. Thank you so much for listening today. I will see those of you who are patrons on Discord, where we will record the seminar that I host after every lecture, in which I answer your questions and engage in further discussion. I will see you guys there.